These mountains are high, rough, and thickly covered with timber and underbrush, and fed with plenty of water from the sparkling springs that bubble from the mountainside, making it a paradise for the moonshiner, feudists, and others who have no regard for law and order. In these mountains, an officer is the most despised of all men. The old natives feel it is their country in which they were reared, and no one, especially a revenuer, as they refer to a prohibition man, or a detective, has a right to enter it to make an arrest or run down a crime. In the hills along the Tug, there has been fought many a feud, among them the Hatfield-McCoy feud, in which both families were almost wiped out. The Tug Fork of the Big Sandy River forms the southwestern border of West Virginia for nearly 90 miles. At a town bordered by the Tug tributary, the undercurrents of another feud came to a crest on May 19, 1920. Matewan, a small incorporated town on the western edge of West Virginia, became the scene of what would soon be called a massacre, in which 10 people were left dead. This feud, however, was between the mine owners and the United Mine Workers Union, who were trying to unionize Mingo County. In the spring of 1920, West Virginia was a hotbed of trouble. The previous winter, a nationwide coal strike had settled. The U.S. Coal Commission had granted an unprecedented 27% wage increase to union miners, but excluded miners in southwestern West Virginia who were non-union. This area was the largest non-unionized coal region in the country, and so the UNW stepped up its work to unionize Logan, Mingo, and McDowell counties. In retaliation, the coal mine owners fired workers suspected of being union sympathizers and then evicted them from the company-owned homes.
What happened preceding the Matewan massacre, the sheriff of the county, Sheriff Blankenship, had been friendly to the coal mine operators, but apparently tried to get them to pay him a large amount of money in order to carry out these evictions. And the coal mine operators refused to pay bribes and, for protection, that type of thing. And so at that point, Sheriff Blankenship aligned himself with the United Mine Workers. And so when the Stone Mountain Coal Company got writs of eviction for, I believe it was 6 homes of 6 miners who were believed to be trying to organize the union in that mine, Blankenship refused to carry out the evictions. And so the officials of the coal company then contracted with Baldwin-Felts to send men to Matewan to carry out these lawful evictions.
On the 19th of May, 1920, Albert C. Felts, superintendent of the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency, stepped off the train from Bluefield into the streets of Matewan, West Virginia. He and 12 other detectives were there at the request of the Stone Mountain Coal Company, which had closed 2 mines and began the eviction proceedings against several men thought to be union sympathizers. The miners had been given proper notice to vacate the company-owned homes, but they had refused eviction. Albert Felts and the other detectives began serving notices on the 6 families. During the evictions, the mayor of Matewan, Cabell Testerman, and his chief of police, Sid Hatfield, arrived at the Stone Mountain Coal Company and confronted Albert Felts. John McDowell, Baldwin-Felts' detective, would testify,
"Hatfield and Testerman appeared about noon. We were still at work. Mr. Felts said, 2 or 3 get your rifles. These men may cause trouble." There were about 40 or 50 men behind Hatfield and Testerman. Sid protested that the evictions were illegal and Albert produced the eviction notices.
Miss Gladys Carnes, 17, who attended school in Matewan, testified,
"I heard Sid ask Felts what right he had to make those evictions. Felts replied, 'I'm doing my lawful duty. I have consulted some of the best lawyers.' Sid said, they would have to be given 10 days' notice, and Felts answered by saying 10 days are up. Felts said if he found he was acting unlawfully, he and his men would come down and give themselves up.
Hatfield and Testerman returned to Matewan, and the evictions continued. Armed with handguns and rifles, some of the detectives stood guard as the evictions took place. The deep forests of the mountains were a perfect place for assailants to gather, but the eviction process went without incident. After returning to Matewan, Mayor Testerman contacted Judge Damron at the county seat in Williamson.
After Mayor Testerman had confirmed that the writs of eviction were legal and there was nothing he could do, that information was shared with the chief of police from Matewan, Sid Hatfield. And Sid Hatfield was upset by the fact that Baldwin-Felts were operating outside his city limits, but nevertheless affecting people that he had a close association with.
Sid Hatfield, adopted into a Hatfield family, had earlier worked in the coal mines. He also had a reputation of being a moonshiner and gambler until being appointed chief of police by Mayor Testerman in 1919. Hatfield belonged to a group of co-conspirators who were active in changing the status quo of the county through whatever means possible. Their headquarters was at the hardware store owned by Reese Chambers, and along with Reese's son Ed, a small group of hand-picked miners would gather to discuss ways to block the mines from operating with scabs. At around 4 p.m., the eviction notices had been completed. John McDowell, Baldwin-Felts detective, testified,
"We finished our work and went back to Aunt Hatfield's hotel. We came back to Matewan in 2 automobiles and stayed at the hotel till 4:45. There were a few rifles in our crowd. These were taken apart and wrapped up."
Only Albert Felts, his brother Lee, and C.B. Cunningham were licensed to carry concealed weapons in Matewan, and so Albert had the other detectives break down their weapons and stow them away in their suitcases. Understanding the hostility in the town, Albert also told the detectives that if they were arrested, to go along peacefully, and that the agency would make bail for them. C.D. Fox, a traveling salesman staying at the hotel, testified he saw the detectives wrapping up their rifles before they started toward the station. After having dinner, the detectives left the Urias Hotel and walked to the tracks to await train number 16, due to arrive at 5:10 p.m. to take them back to Bluefield. At the railroad tracks, Sid Hatfield confronted Albert Felts, telling him that he had a warrant for his arrest coming in on number 16. Albert replied that he was returning the favor as he had an arrest warrant for Sid. Albert was a deputy sheriff of Mingo County, having been appointed 2 years prior by Sheriff Blankenship. Tom Felts, testifying at the congressional hearing, stated,
"My brother had a warrant that day for Sid Hatfield. That warrant was issued by the Justice of the Peace, a merchant named Stafford. The warrant called for Sid Hatfield and others for releasing prisoners, so he directed the warrant to Albert Felts, sent it down there by an employee of the Norfolk Western Railroad to deliver to Albert at Matewan that day."
D.D. Williams, a special agent for the N&W Railway, gave the warrant for Sid Hatfield to Albert Felts when train number 29 arrived in Matewan sometime past 11 a.m. Clyde Long, a 17-year-old student, testified,
"I heard Albert Felts say he had a warrant for him, wanted him to go up the road with him on train 16, and said he would respect him as an officer and not disarm him, leave him keep his guns."
Sid led Albert to the Chambers hardware store, situated a block away around the curve on the railroad tracks. The mayor at that moment, however, was in his jewelry store adjacent to the depot and just a short distance from where Sid met Albert. Hatfield, however, needed to lure the detectives to the hardware store and away from the depot, and the crowd gathering for the arrival of train number 16. Waiting in and around the hardware store just out of view of the depot was a crowd of armed men. Snipers were situated in upper-story windows. W.J. Hatfield testified,
"I saw William Bowman go down past my door with a rifle while I was at the window upstairs. Just a minute before the shooting, William Bowman said, 'You better get your head back in.' This was about 30 seconds to a minute before the shooting."
Moments later, 7 detectives, the mayor of Matewan, and 2 bystanders would be shot dead. Getting to the facts of what happened would become the primary goal of the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. In the wake of the shootings, rumors, innuendos, lies, and half-truths would emerge from Mingo County. In Bluefield, Tom Felts, a partner of the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency, received word at about 6:30 on the evening of the massacre that 7 of his detectives had been shot to death in Matewan. Among the dead were 2 of his brothers. Albert Felts was the superintendent of detectives for the agency. Lee Felts, not connected with the agency, having his own business in Galax, Virginia, had gone along as extra manpower. Also among the dead was C.T. Higgins, the chief of police in Galax. The very next day, the agency would receive a letter with the first list of shooters and witnesses. At the top of the list was Sidney Hatfield. As the wheels of the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency went into high gear, his agents scoured the countryside for any information of witnesses present in Matewan on the day of the tragedy. The killers knew that unfriendly witnesses had to be silenced. In most cases, fear sealed their lips. With others, a simple warning was sufficient to convince them that they saw nothing. Ance Hatfield, however, was a bold, courageous, truthful mountaineer who could neither be bluffed nor intimidated. He had witnessed the slaughter and would tell exactly what he saw. Shortly before the trial date, as he sat smoking on his hotel porch, a rifle cracked and Ance slumped to the floor, a bullet through his head. The perpetrator of that foul murder was never apprehended. Charles Everett Lively was born in 1887 in Kanawha County, West Virginia, and at the age of 13 started working in the coal mines loading coal. He first joined the United Mine Workers around 1902 at Black Band, West Virginia. In 1912, Lively was hired by the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency as a Secret Service agent, mainly involved in investigations of industrial sabotage against the coal companies. Lively was sent to Colorado during the UMW's attempts to unionize Colorado in 1913 to investigate the murder of 4 mine guards. Once in Colorado, he infiltrated the UMW and became vice president of the local in La Veta, where the murders had taken place. After investigations in Missouri, Illinois, Oklahoma, and Kansas, Lively returned to West Virginia. His first trip to Mingo County was in January of 1920 to investigate a store robbery at Red Jacket and the burning of a tipple and coal washer at Chattaroy. Lively was in the headquarters of the United Mine Workers in Charleston when they received the telegram relating the news of the Matewan shootings and the killing of the 7 detectives. When asked what was said at the time they got the news of the killings, Lively replied,
"Most all of them agreed that it was a mighty good thing, seemed to enjoy it. Charles Bately, an international organizer especially. He kind of shook hands with himself, danced around the floor, and said it was the best news he had had for a long while."
A month and a half after the massacre, C.E. Lively would surreptitiously arrive in Matewan and open up a restaurant in a building owned by the United Mine Workers. Having been a miner and with his connections to the union, Lively quickly gained the confidence of the locals, including participants in the murders. Sid Hatfield and 23 other participants were indicted for the murder of Albert C. Felts. 4 defendants would eventually be nulled from prosecution. The trial almost never began. With 19 defendants from a county of less than 27,000 people, it proved almost impossible to find 12 jurors and 8 alternates that qualified for jury duty. Either they were related to one of the defendants, were members of the United Mine Workers, or subject to other restrictions. The prosecution had already used 2 continuances. By law at that time, a 3rd continuance would have set all the men free and clear of any further prosecution. Finally, after 22 days of jury selection, the requisite number of jurors were found qualified, and the trial finally began. One of the first things that the prosecution would try to establish was that there was a conspiracy that occurred in Matewan to kill the detectives. Jeff Stafford, a clerk at Chambers' hardware store, would testify that earlier on the day of the evictions, Ezra Fry, a UMW official, purchased $300 worth of rifles and ammunition from him to give to the miners. The town was arming itself for confrontation. Dr. W.J. Hill, Matewan dentist, quoted Mayor Testerman as saying,
"I can't give you authority to carry pistols, but you can get rifles or shotguns."
Also in Testerman's store, George Whitten saw Reese Chambers with a high-powered rifle. When something was said about the gun, Chambers replied, "I got one I can do something with." Born and raised in Matewan, Miss May Chafin was employed as an operator at the telephone exchange. At approximately a half an hour before the massacre began, Sid Hatfield called Mingo County Deputy Sheriff Tony Webb at the county seat in Williamson. During court testimony, Miss Chafin related Sid Hatfield's conversation with Webb.
"Just tell the jury exactly what he said. I want to get it in the record. I know you don't like to repeat it. Just say what Sid Hatfield said."
He said they would kill the goddamn son of bitches before they left town.
"You heard him say that over the phone?"
Yes, Miss Chambers and I were together.
"Which Miss Chambers?
Miss Elsie Chambers."
Is she the daughter of Reese Chambers?"
"Yes, sir."
Isaac Brewer, a defendant who turned state's evidence, was standing between Hatfield and Felts as Mayor Testerman arrived. Brewer testified,
"Just a minute before the shooting started, Sid Hatfield put his hands up to my ears and said,
'Let's kill every damned one of them.'
I stepped back. Sid shot Felts with a .44 Special. Sid was within 3 or 4 feet of Felts. Felts fell to the floor dead."
Jeff Stafford, a clerk at Chambers' hardware store, testified,
"I was standing 1 or 2 feet from Sid Hatfield and saw him fire the first shot of the battle at Albert Felts. The shot from Hatfield's pistol was followed by a great many more shots, but I did not see anybody else shoot as I ran upstairs as soon as the shooting began."
Chillingly, C.E. Lively would recount what Sid himself told him about the incident during the time he was running the restaurant.
Sid told me he and Albert walked down the street that ran beside the railroad tracks. He said he had his hands on Albert Felts when he was walking down laughing and talking. He swore and spoke to Albert, called him a bad name, and told me he knew he was taking him off to kill him. Sid and Albert got down by the hardware store, and someone called to Sid. Sid asked permission of Albert to speak to this fellow, and Albert said, "Sure." He walked over to the hardware store and stood there talking. Mayor Testerman came down and asked Albert Felts to arrange bond for Sid. Albert told him no, he couldn't give him bond, that he was only an officer. He said Testerman looked at the warrant and said, "Oh, it is bogus anyway." Sid told me he stuck a gun right close up to Albert Felts' head and shot him. Sid then laughed about how it happened, said Albert's glasses flew up off his face and his lips quivered, and he fell to his knees dead. He told me he then shot the mayor. I asked him why he did it. He said he was getting too well lined up with those Baldwin-Felts men.
John McDowell, Baldwin-Felts' detective, would testify,
Testerman had joined Felts and Hatfield in the store. The first shot was fired in or near the door. Some of us were along the track. I heard one shot, and then it seemed 100 or 150 more were fired quickly. I saw but one man shooting. That was Reese Chambers, armed with a rifle, standing below the store door. I ran toward the post office and got behind a telephone pole. Bullets flew all around me. Shots were coming from all different places, and I thought all of our fellows were killed. I ran past the bank building and swam across Mate Creek. While in the creek, they shot at me. I had swam about 400 yards, and they continued to shoot until I disappeared around a curve.
Detective J.W. Ferguson, making it several blocks from the hardware store where his companions were shot. Wounded and almost helpless, Ferguson had been assisted to Mrs. Duty's home by John Akers.
"Fellows, I'm shot to pieces,"
Ferguson stated. Akers and a companion assisted him to the porch but ran when he saw several men, one armed with a rifle, coming through the house from the front. Akers had not gone more than 20 or 30 feet before he heard shots. Thomas Chafin of Matewan told of the body of Detective Ferguson being carried on 2 rifles by the accused, and quoted N.H. Atwood as saying about the rifles, "They carried them in, and we'll carry them out on them." Detective Captain G.W. Anderson would testify,
Shooting broke out in general all around. My brother grabbed a grip of revolvers and I grabbed a rifle that was in a case. My brother, Detective Higgins, and I ran down the street. Higgins was fatally shot through the back and fell on his face. I was shot through the right shoulder. My brother and I ran into this building, what is called the clubhouse. I started upstairs but saw a man with a rifle. I ran back down and went out the back door of the house. We took refuge in the kitchen of the house next door. He cut open the handbag and we each got a gun. We stayed there until train 16 arrived, then slipped out the back and reached a Pullman coach. We were helped on the train. A crowd ran up and someone yelled, "There goes 2 of the goddamned sons of bitches." However, no one came in the car after us.
Detective O.L. Bennett testified,
I heard the first shot, which was followed by a volley with continuous shooting. I was in search of a pack of cigarettes at the time. I turned away from the hardware store and walked to the railroad station and entered the waiting room. I threw away a package of warrants and summons which I carried. When train number 16 arrived, I boarded the train without incident.
Detective Hildebrand testified,
I saw the flash of the first shot. It was inside the building. I turned my head and a bullet went through my hat. Then I ran. Shots seemed to come from every direction. Crack, crack, one after the other. About 150 of them. I ran from the scene and took refuge in a coal and wood shack and hid in a sugar barrel in which I stayed for over 6 hours. At 11:30, I got out of the barrel. It had become quiet around there. I jumped out the window and lit a cigarette and began puffing. I then walked down the tracks whistling. I had the idea it was natural if anyone was looking out, watching to shoot, he would take a man going down the road whistling for granted as one of the town men.
The wounds of the detectives were described by the coroner who examined the bodies in Williamson that night, substantiating that snipers were positioned in the 2nd-story buildings.
I examined their bodies about 9 o'clock on the night of May 19th at the undertaking establishment of M.T. Ball. C.B. Cunningham had a wound in the right thigh. The bullet had entered at the rear. There was no exit. The leg was broken. Another wound in the left hip. Bullet fired from the rear. Still another bullet entered the top of his head and ranged downward. There was a wound in the left shoulder. The bullet ranging downward into the chest and making no exit. A.J. Booher had a scalp wound on the back of his head. It ranged downward. There was another bullet wound in the right side. No exit. It had been fired from the rear. Another bullet wound in the right hip, ranged downward. E.O. Powell sustained a wound along a rib, the bullet making exit over the left kidney. There were no other wounds. This one was sufficient to cause death. C.T. Higgins had been shot through the back, also in the left hip. His face was covered by mud and blood. J.W. Ferguson had a wound through the arm and into his chest. There was another in the abdomen, no exit. Lee Felts had a bullet wound on the left side, entering from the rear and penetrating his body. This was the only wound. Albert Felts was shot 4 times. There was one through his left arm below the elbow. Another bullet had entered the right ear, another through his right shoulder, and another through his left cheek. There were powder burns about the ear, indicating that the pistol was within 18 inches. Either of the head wounds was sufficient to cause death.
On March 21, 1921, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty for all of the defendants. When he received news of the verdict, Tom Felts stated,
"Fear is responsible for the verdict. The verdict of this jury signifies one thing, a miscarriage of justice, and fully demonstrates to everyone that knows the facts of this case that it was more popular among a certain element in this county to be a desperado than to be a law-abiding citizen. A guiltier, more cold-blooded bunch of murderers never pulled a gallows rope than those who have just been turned loose by the jury this morning. It is a sad day for justice in bloody Mingo."
C.E. Lively acquired a vast amount of intelligence for the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency in the 7 months he ran his business in Matewan, not all of it concerning the Matewan massacre. In early August 1920, 2 Union men arrived at Lively's restaurant.
They came to my place and introduced themselves to me, said they were up there to conduct guerrilla warfare, and said they were sent there by Mr. Mooney. They said that Mr. Mooney told them they could rely on me to help them out. They said that the Mohawk was running plenty of coal and was doing most as good as before the strike, and that there had to be something done, that the spirit of those men up there were broken, and they was going to shoot it up. They said they wanted me to introduce them to Sid Hatfield. Sid pledged himself to assist them in any way he could in getting men to agree to go up there to help shoot up the population.
Because of his involvement in helping organize the attack on Mohawk, Sid Hatfield was indicted and summoned to appear at the courthouse at Welch in the neighboring county of McDowell on August 1, 1921, barely 4 months after the end of the trial. The courthouse sits atop a hill and is accessed by 2 staircases and a landing. As Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers walked up the second set of stairs, C.E. Lively appeared above them with several Baldwin-Felts detectives, and a gunfight ensued. C.E. Lively would claim self-defense, as Sid Hatfield had stated numerous times that he would kill Lively on sight. At a subsequent trial, Lively and 2 other Baldwin-Felts agents would be found not guilty. The story of the Matewan Massacre has been told in many different ways in the years since the tragedy. The public's perception of the incident has been formed by fantastical oral traditions, myths, outright lies, and few truthful facts. H.C. Lewis discovered the personal papers of Thomas L. Felts in an old warehouse, which chronicled the event. The papers included actual trial testimony, the inner office memos of the detective agency, newspaper accounts of the massacre, and more. He donated the archive to the Eastern Regional Coal Archives in Bluefield, West Virginia. This is the largest collection of extant files of the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. It was from these archives this documentary was formed. William Baldwin died in 1936 at age 75, and Thomas Felts a year later at age 69. In 1937, 4 months before his death, Thomas Felts formally dissolved the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. In 1961, Judge Bailey, who presided over the Matewan trial, told Howard B. Lee, the author of Bloodletting in Appalachia.
The defense testimony in the Mate Juan trial was a tissue of the most fantastic falsehoods I ever had to listen to during my years on the bench.